So without any further ado, we are going to get started with our webinar. Our first presenter today is Dr. Richard Leroff. He's the Executive Director of the Investor Environmental Health Network and has been kind enough to take some time out of his day to provide us with an overview of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Leroff. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've been tasked with delivering hydraulic fracturing 101. There's a limit of 15 minutes, so this will necessarily be a cursory overview. Let me start with an important point about terminology. There's a broad sense of the word fracking, and there's a narrow sense of the word fracking. In its narrowest technical sense, fracking is basically the splitting of rock by water pressure. Hydraulic fracturing is basically the splitting of rock as a result of very, very heavy water pressure. It occurs in a shale formation that frequently is present many thousands of feet below the ground. The broader use of the word fracking is basically to the entire life cycle of natural gas operations in shale formations. And I tend to use fracking in the broadest sense when one is looking at the environmental and social risks of natural gas operations in shales or fracking. One has to take a broad life cycle view. So let me just take you through that life cycle very briefly. There's a cross-section of it on your screens. So we begin with the movement of millions of gallons of water, thousands of gallons of chemicals, tons of sand to the drill site. You can see the trucks there. The well is drilled. The well will have multiple layers of steel pipes, metal pipes, and cement. It will begin vertically and go down to just above the shale formation. Note in the diagram that groundwater, frequently used for drinking water purposes, is present in maybe the first 5, 6, 7, 800 feet below the surface. The vertical well goes many thousands of feet below that, and then it turns horizontal into the shale formation. The shale formation typically, this will vary from formation to formation, typically several hundred feet thick. When the fracking begins, millions of gallons of water, thousands of gallons of chemicals, and sand are pumped down through the well. There are holes punched in the horizontal portion of the pipe, and the water bursts out into the formation through those holes. As the process continues, some of the water and chemicals that have been put down come back up to the surface. In addition, aside from the gas, of course, there are other fluids that have been down there for millions of years that come up. These other fluids are called produced water, are very, very salty. They're brines. They can contain naturally occurring organic chemicals, and they can also contain naturally occurring radioactive materials. The volume of radioactive materials will vary from formation to formation. It's more of an issue in the Marcellus, I think, than any place else. All that wastewater comes up. It's got to be stored on site, and then it ultimately needs to be disposed of via pipeline or truck, or else recycled. In addition to concerns about water, there are air emissions associated with the life cycle of these natural gas operations. All this water has to be pushed down the pipe, so there are diesel generators, engines, and the like that produce emissions on the pad. You've got pipes and tanks, all of which can leak. And then you've got all the emissions from the trucks that are hauling water to the site, or that may be hauling water waste away from the site. If we can go to that's the summary overview. If we can go to the second slide, please, Tyler. Thank you. So there is a range of environmental and social impacts from the various facets of the life cycle, and there are various things companies can do to reduce them. Experts generally agree that the key issue is well integrity. You'll see reports of various contamination incidents, pollution incidents, and they essentially stem from poor well construction. The quality of the cement jobs that is being done is not what it might be. Companies have the technology, they have the knowledge to build these, to drill these wells correctly, but obviously they don't always do so. Another aspect of the environmental impact is chemicals, the chemicals that are used for these processes. This is one of the largest public concerns. It has been. There are two aspects of this. One is disclosure. The other is the actual toxicity of the chemicals used. Going back 2 or 3 years, looking back 2 or 3 years, it was very difficult to get the companies to disclose what chemicals they were using. Now there's broad disclosure, or much broader disclosure. There's a website called FracFocus, FRACFOCUS.org, that lists well-by-well disclosures of the chemicals being used. Some companies put the well-by-well disclosures on their company websites, and more states have been adopting regulations that require disclosure, either to the states and or to the public at large. In terms of toxicity, companies have been a number of companies have been reducing both the volume of chemicals they use and the toxicity of the chemicals they use. Some of the major suppliers like Halliburton and Baker Hughes actually have toxicity scoring systems, so people buying their chemicals can see the relative hazards of the chemicals that they are using or that they might use. Water sourcing. There's concern over the use of fresh water for fracking because so many millions of gallons are used. One sees a number of companies looking to alternative sources of water for their fracking operations. Non-potable water in Louisiana, there's a company that's using wastewater discharges from a paper plant, and particularly in the Marcellus shale in Pennsylvania, there's quite a bit of recycling of water, of the water that comes up from the well. Waste storage and disposal. In terms of storage, you can store in pits, lined or unlined, or in tanks. Tanks are preferable. Lots of things can go wrong with pits. Just like they say that the largest risks from natural gas operations and shales are from poor well construction, there seems to be a sizable body of expert opinion that believes the other major source of contamination risk is from spills on the surface from pits or from bursting pipes, those kinds of things. In terms of disposal, there are mainly two options at the present time. The most popular one in most places is deep well injection. Specially constructed wells constructed in compliance with federal and state regulations. They go down 10, 12, 14,000 feet, pretty deep into the earth, specifically designed to accommodate the waste from oil and gas operations. The earthquakes that you've been reading about. The other option is especially popular in Pennsylvania, about the Marcellus shale, is recycling and reuse of the produced water. If you don't recycle or reuse it, basically you've got to ship it off into Ohio and West Virginia for disposal in deep wells, since there are only at most a half dozen deep disposal wells in Pennsylvania. It used to be the case that drillers could dispose of waste in Pennsylvania in municipal or private sewage treatment plants, but that option has largely disappeared. So it is just the two, deep well injection and recycling and reuse as disposal methods. With respect to reducing air emissions, on their drill pads, companies can substitute natural gas or electricity for diesel-based operations. They can take measures to reduce the fugitive emissions from tanks, pressure gauges, those kinds of things. And with respect to the emissions from trucks, many companies, shouldn't say many, but quite a few companies look to build temporary pipelines for sourcing their water for their drilling operations. If you put in a pipeline, then you don't have to rely on trucks, and so you reduce the emissions from the truck traffic. Finally, community consultations and consent and cumulative impacts remain a significant challenge. In terms of the community impacts, one category is simply the nuisance. It's the noise, the truck traffic, how close the operations are to community facilities, to individual residences, those kinds of things. But in a separate category, there is the vision of the community, differences on what people want for their community. These are basically industrial processes. Folks, particularly in relatively sparsely populated rural areas, kind of like the quiet. They like the rural character. They don't want to see it disrupted. There are differences of vision within communities. There are economic winners and economic losers. There are health effects, and as a consequence, you get a fracturing within communities because of the diversity of opinion. Last but not least, there is the issue of cumulative impacts. Even if on an individual basis, a particular well might not cause that big a problem, if you have intense development, as you have, for example, in some of the counties in Pennsylvania, the cumulative impacts in terms of road traffic, air emissions, those kinds of things can be pretty sizable. And we just generally don't do a very good job of addressing cumulative impacts. Next slide, please. So the Investor Environmental Health Network, a couple of whose members I see are on the line, has been talking to companies for the last 3 years about environmental risks and how they manage them. Basically, as investors, we want to know how well the companies recognize what the risks are and what measures they're taking to control them. This is an indication of the quality of corporate management, can help indicate which companies recognize the benefits from sound environmental practices and which companies may end up with something blowing up in the middle of the night because the practices aren't very good. So we filed shareholder resolutions at total of about 20 different companies asking for greater disclosure to share owners of environmental risks and management practices. And in December of this year, our organization, the Investor Environmental Health Network, and the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility published Extracting the Facts, an investor guide to disclosing risks from hydraulic fracturing operations. And that basically gathers all the insights we've gained over 3 years of talking to companies. Companies wanted to know, well, what are you looking for? And so we decided to tell them what we thought they should be reporting on. The guide has, next slide, please. The guide has, next slide, please. Thank you. The guide has 12 core management goals. For example, one goal is the virtual elimination of toxic chemicals. A second goal is secure community consent to operations. Some of the goals are aspirational. Some of the goals are achievable today. Then we indicate the best management practices or some of the best management practices to implement the goals, and we suggest indicators that companies can use to report on their progress. Because we talked to so many companies, the guidelines are very, very rich with examples from many companies, 17 in total. We found the companies which we thought were implementing best practices, and we pointed to them. And in doing so, the idea is to encourage a race to the top. Basically, we want to see greater use of best management practices across the industry. An important underlying concept of the guidelines is comply or explain. When one gets into conversations about best management practices, one frequently hears the comment, well, one size doesn't fit all. Our situation is different. And the way we've approached that is to say, look, we understand that, but we think by and large you should be using best management practices, so here's what we want you to do. If in those circumstances where you're not using them, please tell us, share with us the good reasons why you're not. And I'm approaching exactly the 15-minute mark, so I'm going to stop there. If you display the next slide, that has the URL for our report, or else you simply just go to our website, www.iehn.org, and you can get to it through our website. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. That was a wonderful overview, and thank you for being so mindful of our time. I really appreciate that. So now we're going to have a small technical shift. We're going to move, switching over to our second presenter, who is Megan Fleming. Megan works for the Environmental Protection Agency in their Office of Research and Development, and she's actually on their hydraulic fracturing team. So she's going to share a bit with us today about the EPA's work to explore, as you can see on this very slide, hydraulic fracturing's impact on drinking water, and help us understand the work that the EPA is doing to get a good scientific background for hydraulic fracturing and its impacts on our communities and on our water systems. Thank you to our technical assistant who's getting our PDF up there so quickly. And now I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
Okay, thanks Tyler, and thanks everyone else for tuning in today. I'm going to give you a brief overview of EPA's study of the potential impact of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water resources. This study comes out of EPA's Office of Research and Development, which is the science arm of EPA. We support science and research and rulemaking, but it's important to keep in mind we're not actually making any regulations in the Office of Research and Development. So please keep that in mind later, that I'll be only able to answer questions related to the study and nothing related to hydraulic fracturing regulations. So today, I want to provide a brief background, tell you about some research approaches we're using in our study, and you're probably curious when we'll be reporting results, so I'll give you some information there as well. In recent years, the combination of horizontal drilling with hydraulic fracturing has really opened up new areas in the United States for oil and gas development. And the map you see here shows gas shale plays in the lower 48 states. If you're not familiar with the term shale play or play in general, a play is essentially a set of accumulations sharing certain geologic or geographic properties, and this is an area where a resource is aggregated that can be exploited for oil and gas development. Our study also covers shale oil plays, coal bed methane, tight sands, and other resources that are going to be accessible for oil and gas development in the continental United States. Our purpose of this study here is to assess whether hydraulic fracturing may have an impact on drinking water resources, and if so, what might the driving factors be. So in order to understand the potential effects of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water resources, we're looking at the water cycle used during hydraulic fracturing, and I'll explain exactly what that means in just a minute. We did this study because Congress urged us to study the impact of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water using the best available science, independent sources of information, a transparent peer-reviewed process, consulting with other stakeholders and other government agencies, and using rigorous quality assurance procedures. So these are the underlying tenets of our study. And as I said just a moment ago, our study looks at all the points throughout hydraulic fracturing where drinking water resources may be impacted. And so this will be a little bit of a repeat of Rich's slide, but I want to highlight the specific points in the water cycle here. So the first step is water acquisition. Water has to be brought from another place to the site to do the hydraulic fracturing operation. This source water, as we call it, can come from groundwater or surface water. And the next step, chemical mixing, this water brought on site is mixed with certain chemicals and proppants. And if you're not familiar with the term proppant, remember Rich mentioned sand going down into the well bore. A proppant is essentially a granular substance like sand. Also, aluminum pellets can be used. And this proppant is suspended in the hydrofracking fluid. And essentially, when it goes down deep well injected, this proppant keeps the cracks open in the rock so that the resource can be exploited. Third stage in the water cycle, well injection. This mixture of chemicals and proppants is injected at really high pressure into the well, and it goes down to a level that's to be fractured. Then when that pressure is released, the material comes back up to the surface. It's blended with naturally occurring materials from that layer that was fractured, and this is known as the flowback and produced water. Finally, your fracturing operation produces all this wastewater that needs to be stored temporarily in a pit or a tank until it's actually eventually taken off-site to be reused, recycled. It can be treated or disposed of. And so that's the last step in the water cycle, as we refer to it, known as wastewater treatment and waste disposal. Some unique characteristics of hydraulic fracturing, which is being compared to conventional oil and gas exploration, is the use of proppant, chemical mixing, and this very large volumes of water used. It can range on like the 3 to 5 million gallons range. So we're asking research questions at each stage in the water cycle to help guide our study. So 5 stages: water acquisition, chemical mixing, well injection, flowback and produced water, and wastewater treatment and waste disposal. We want to know what are the impacts of all these, at all these stages, what are the impacts that may affect drinking water resources. And so for water acquisition, what is the impact of large volume water withdrawals from our ground and our surface water? For chemical mixing, what happens if these chemicals are spilled on or near the well pad? And when we're injecting this chemical mixture at high pressure, what's the impact on that? And flowback and produced water, when this flowback and produced water comes back up the well, what happens if that is spilled on or near the well pad? What's the effect of that? And finally, we're looking at what could be the potential impacts of inadequate treatment of the wastewater produced in hydraulic fracturing. To do this, we're analyzing existing data. We want to know what's already out there, what is already known. We're looking at case studies to collect our own new data in the field. We're also doing scenario evaluations, which you can think of as modeling to explore realistic or hypothetical scenarios throughout the water cycle. We're also doing lab studies, which is to do targeted research. And finally, we're doing some toxicity assessments. And EPA is going to summarize existing data regarding the toxicity and potential human health effects, which could be associated with potential drinking water contaminants. And where necessary, we're going to pursue additional tox studies to assess which chemicals might be of particular concern. So when we're analyzing existing data, we're looking at peer-reviewed literature, data from state and federal agencies, and we're also looking at industry responses to information requests that we've sent out in the past. We're also digging into many publicly available databases, one being Fracking, which was mentioned by Rich. So when we're analyzing existing data, we want to understand where wells are located, what are the construction practices, and what is the amount of water that's used in the different shale plays. We want to know what chemicals are out there and what is the composition of flowback and produced water. We're also looking for standard operating procedures that are out there in the industry right now. And we want to know what's the frequency, severity, and the causes of spills that are occurring. We're also looking into treatment and disposal practices that are currently in use. As I mentioned, we're doing case studies. We selected these 5 locations, the Bakken Shale, Barnett Shale, 2 different retrospective case studies in the Marcellus Shale, and finally one in the Raton Basin in Colorado. The purpose of these retrospective case studies is to assess whether hydraulic fracturing contributed to what was reported drinking water contamination. And these case studies are essentially designed to examine the conditions that may be associated with potential contamination of drinking water resources. And then if we do find that there was an association, we want to identify the factors that may lead to human exposure and risk. And so you can see here, these different retrospective case study locations represent different types of hydrocarbon plays. So you can see the Bakken Shale contains oil, the Barnett Shale and Marcellus Shale both contain gas, and coal bed methane is a different resource also used in fracking in the Raton Basin. Just to give you a quick update on where we are on these retrospective case studies, you can see that throughout all these retrospective case studies, we've sampled domestic, industrial, production, monitoring, and municipal well types. We've also sampled surface water. Our first round of sampling took place in the period from July to November 2011, and currently we are auditing the quality of that data. Next steps, which occurs anytime you move from one sampling trip to the next sampling trip, you have to quality assure and quality control your data. So we're working on that now. And our next sample collection is currently underway in certain locations. And this next sample collection was originally slated for the March to July 2012 timeframe. And moving on from retrospective case studies, we're also evaluating potential scenarios for water impacts. So this is the modeling exercise that I mentioned. We want to explore the potential cumulative impact from water withdrawals. So what is the potential impact for taking a very large amount of water out of a certain resource, and what is the impact in that area? We want to model various failure scenarios that might occur and cause contaminants to actually migrate in the subsurface and potentially contaminate drinking water resources due to a well failure. Finally, we're exploring potential cumulative impacts from surface water disposal of treated hydraulic fracturing wastewater. This would occur if we are treating wastewater in a conventional wastewater treatment plant, and then we're mixing it back with regular surface water. What is the impact of that? I mentioned we're doing laboratory work. Here we're doing targeted research to determine the effectiveness of current wastewater treatment technologies in conventional wastewater treatment plants. We're also assessing potential for this treated wastewater to impact drinking water resources at certain points in the water cycle. And additionally, we acknowledge the fact that as we go along in the study, we may have to tweak our analytical methods, and so that's another component of the research that's going to take place in the lab. And finally, we want to study the geochemical reactions that take place between the hydrofrac fluids and the target formations, such as the shale. In our toxicity assessments, which is our final research approach I mentioned, we're focusing on hydraulic fracturing fluids, wastewater, and the naturally occurring substances that exist deep down in the geological layers in the subsurface. Here we're summarizing the chemical, physical, toxicological properties of these known chemicals, and we want to estimate the chemical, physical, tox properties using what we call a structure-activity relationship. And so we want to know, for different kinds of chemical structure, how does that affect the activity in the subsurface? And finally, where necessary, EPA is considering pursuing additional tox studies to screen and assess the toxicity of certain chemicals of concern. And finally, where are we in reporting our results? We have said from the beginning that we are going to release a report at the end of 2012, so expect to see that in late December this year. And in this report, you'll see what we've done so far in analyzing existing data. You should see the results of a literature review and scenario evaluations. You'll see the initial steps of our modeling. You'll see some laboratory studies that have gone underway so far, and you'll see updates to where we are on our case study research. In 2014, which is anticipated to be our final report associated with this study, you should see what was built upon the 2012 report and additional analysis of existing data. You should see the full package of retrospective and prospective case studies, which I didn't mention before because they're not currently underway. Prospective case studies will occur when EPA actually drills a well from the beginning to the end. We're not looking backwards in time with the prospective case studies. We're starting from the beginning of the well, and we're looking forward in time to see how the water cycle may be impacted at all stages of the hydraulic fracturing operation. So those aren't currently underway, but expect those in the 2014 report. We'll have additional scenario evaluations, additional information on our lab studies, and finally, the 2014 report will include information on our tox assessments, which won't be in the 2012 report at all. And so that is my brief overview of what is generally going on in our study. Unfortunately, with the time constraints, I didn't have the opportunity to delve into any detailed analysis of the projects. But for more information, you can go to www.epa.gov/hfstudy for more information. And thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. That was a wonderful overview, and I can only imagine it was pretty hard getting that down to the 15-minute time constraint, but thank you for making that possible. I'm sure we'll have a number of questions for you just about how that study is working itself out and ways that people can get involved. So now we've had a good overview of sort of what hydraulic fracturing looks like, how the EPA is taking a look at this process and what it means, particularly as it relates to water. And our final presenter is going to give us an idea of how we can connect this back to our faith. So we thought this would be a nice way to end our webinar today. Our third presenter is Reverend Mark Terwilliger. He is a pastor at Beach Lake United Methodist Church up in Beach Lake, Pennsylvania, which for those of you who are at all like me, didn't know where Beach Lake was until a couple years ago at least. It's up in the very, very northeast corner of Pennsylvania, almost just a stone's throw from New York. So Mark and members of his congregation have actually been dealing with hydraulic fracturing in their community, in their state, and addressing it on a pretty frequent basis. So we thought Mark would be a wonderful person just to help us connect hydraulic fracturing to our faith and some of the ways that we can be looking at this issue. So now I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Mark Terwilliger. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Tyler, for inviting me to participate in this. I'm grateful for Richard and Megan for their technical expertise, and to all of you who have logged on today because of your interest. My first slide shows Howdy Doody's mute sidekick, Clarabelle the Clown, who would honk and point to indicate yes or no. I will admit I'm not much more articulate than Clarabelle, especially when it comes to hydraulic fracturing, but I find that I've been honking and pointing as a way to say to the church that there is something that we need to talk about. Like any issue, we might not all see eye to eye on something, but if you think of the church as a family that clams up about certain issues, is at best dysfunctional. So regardless of my personal stance, I've sought to encourage the church to talk about this particular issue, especially in the United Methodist Church, where we still say there are more United Methodist Church buildings than U.S. post offices. We can have quite an impact upon the society around us. So in this segment, I'm going to review my growing awareness of hydraulic fracturing and how I have attempted to engage the church in conversation and hopefully eventually action. Prior to any awareness that I've had of hydraulic fracturing, I had lived and served the church in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania from 1993 to 98. Found myself surrounded by comb banks. That's the residue from coal mining, and I recognized that the landscape contributed to a sense within me that something wasn't right. It was like a constant low-lying feeling of depression. And it did not occur to me back then that I should maybe look into this environmental issue and try to figure out what, if anything, that I could do about it. It just so happened that the lay leader of my church at the time worked as an engineer for the DEP, and the focus of his energy was acid mine runoff. I just spoke with his wife last summer, and this is indeed the work that he continues to do. Now, mind you, coal mining in this area has not been in full force since 1959, yet he continues to do this work in acid mine runoff. Early on in my awareness of this emerging natural gas industry, I had heard of people who went door to door inviting landowners to sign leases with gas companies. Those signing leases were encouraged to keep the terms to themselves, lest neighbors use the information as a negotiating point. So there seemed to be a secrecy that developed among neighbors, and of course that developed into a mistrust. A group of property owners in our county, Wayne County, Pennsylvania, decided to form an organization, the Northern Wayne Property Owners Alliance, for the purpose of collective bargaining. And this would benefit local landowners not only financially, but also put greater environmental safeguards into leases with gas companies. As opposition to fracking grew in our region, the Property Owners Alliance came to be seen as the pro-fracking group. Concerned citizens made attempts on what was occurring. Convinced that the church should be at the forefront of emerging societal issues, I wanted my congregation to be involved. So through a series of emails and meetings, I made an attempt to engage our membership in this issue. A few saw the relevance and joined the conversation. A few were opposed that the church would even consider being involved, and there were a variety of reasons for that. Most were indifferent. One of my members happened to be a cooperative extension agent who was enthusiastic at first about our interest, but became uncomfortable with going to a church that might express opinions about something that increasingly became part of his work responsibility. Public meetings that were held became increasingly tense. It was apparent that the issue of fracking was having a polarizing effect in our county. Local newspapers were beginning to cover hydraulic fracturing as an emerging national and local industry. Photos often accompanied articles to further illustrate the industry's environmental impact. As conventional farms continued to cease operating, and as discouraged farmers increasingly signed leases in order to be able to retain their land, the role of the cooperative extension shifted. Because of the nature of their involvement, the cooperative extension has come to be seen as a proponent of hydraulic fracturing. As it turns out, Range Resources is now a major sponsor of WPSU, Penn State's public radio station. Increasingly, I sought to get the attention of major church organizations that might help to address fracking from a theological perspective. And Tyler, thank you for responding on behalf of the National Council of Churches Eco-Justice Program and working with a local group from my church and community to put forth material on our church's website to guide people in thinking about gas drilling from a faith perspective. Besides helping with material on our website, Tyler traveled to northeastern Pennsylvania to resource a public discussion that was held at our church. And indeed, one of the participants was the director of one of our church camps because they had been considering signing a lease. Some media resources gained reputations from their posture on fracking. The River Reporter, based in Narrowsburg, New York, 5 miles from our church, came to be known as a strong voice of caution. The objectivity of public radio stations became increasingly questioned as gas companies such as Chesapeake and the Natural Gas Alliance became major sponsors. A local filmmaker, Josh Fox, who spent summers in Wayne County, became a voice for locals who were concerned about fracking's impact. A group opposed to hydraulic fracturing developed. They are the Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, and and they and the Northern Wayne Property Owners Alliance seemed to be organizations that were on diametric opposite ends of the spectrum. I was grateful when my ministry colleague, Lori Stewart, invited me to participate on the Upper Delaware River Roundtable. Lori, who's the Unitarian minister in Beach Lake and the publisher of the River Reporter, invited me to participate in this meeting that happens every 2 months, comprised of a group of people from both the Pennsylvania and New York sides of the Upper Delaware River to discuss issues we have in common. As you can imagine, for the past several years, the focus has been on fracking. Participants have included township supervisors, members of town planning commissions, national park employees, employees of the Delaware River Basin Commission, members of nonprofit environmental organizations, farmers, and any interested citizens. Discussions have included the benefits, costs, and impacts of fracking, consolidation of disparate regulatory systems at varying levels, which of course create loopholes, a webinar with a person who headed up a health impact assessment in Garfield County, Colorado, a mapping project that maps sensitive areas along the Upper Delaware, the preparedness of area medical facilities to respond to crises, say somebody was exposed to the unnamed chemicals that are in fracking fluid. Through this, I've learned a lot, not enough to be an expert on the topic, but enough to keep honking the horn. An environmental group offered to speak with our church about mountaintop removal. I had them come in for an evening program. My logic was that if locals heard them, they would see the parallels between this industry in the Appalachian Mountains and fracking in our own area. Despite very intentional publicity, I'm sad to say very few people attended the meeting. After a couple of attempts to engage our United Methodist Board of Church and Society, they responded by inviting me to write an article outlining why fracking should be an issue for the church. After I published this with the Church and Society, I began to receive occasional emails from people around the country wanting to engage further in this conversation. About the time that 60 Minutes ran a feature on shaleonaires, my wife took a trip across Route 6 in Pennsylvania's northern tier. We had taken the same trip as a family a few years prior. When she returned, she had many accounts to tell about how the gas industry had so greatly impacted northern Pennsylvania in those few intervening years. We had a chance to hear uber sustainable farmer from Virginia, Joel Salatin, speak locally. During the Q&A period, somebody asked him about fracking. He declined to elaborate, but was willing to say sudden wealth is not a good term solution to a long-term problem. I thought about how long it took fossil fuels to form, how quickly we harvest and burn them up, and then how long it takes to heal the impact from our mining endeavors. I was invited by the Wilkes-Barre District Clergy and Spouses Fellowship to lead a discussion about fracking. I had them think about hydraulic fracturing from various perspectives by putting themselves in the shoes of gas company executives, speculative landowners, discouraged farmers, struggling congregations, or personnel at church camps that have gone through cuts in their funding, restaurant and motel owners, law firms, county commissioners, or township boards of supervisors, sustainable farmers who are running CSAs, community-supported agricultures, people whose careers revolve around renewable energy, those who work for tourism bureaus, and those whose livelihoods revolve around outdoor recreation. Recently, our annual conference, the Susquehanna Conference, passed a resolution on hydraulic fracturing, which I don't have time to share in detail, but essentially it asks us to tap into our theological roots and to engage in community discussions and decisions as they pertain to hydraulic fracturing. So I'm also attempting to engage the wider community because the question is, if fracking does come to Wayne County, Pennsylvania, and it's teetering on the brink of it, will the economic boom cause all boats to rise? I've challenged people to think about our recent history with the nearby anthracite industry that brought immigrants in droves for 150 years, and of course came to a crashing halt in 1959 with the Knox mine disaster. My question is, who benefited financially from this industry? Did the coal barons invest any of their money in future cleanup endeavors that go on today, 60-some years later? Did the public gain as much as they have thus far invested in the cleanup effort? With hydraulic fracturing, are farmers likely to return to farming after their land is mined for natural gas? Who will clean up from fracking? And what will the cleanup effort look like in 10 years, 50 years? Will fossil fuel even be a major source of our energy then? Who will be paying for the cleanup? Who will have benefited? Instead of raise just the negatives about the potential hazards of gas drilling, I like to promote positive alternatives such as a local sustainable agriculture endeavor that is up and running in Wayne County. Our church started a community garden to raise appreciation for where our food comes from. And I would like to conclude by presenting the hydraulic fracturing version of the golden rule, which is do to those downstream as you would have those upstream do to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. So I recognize that we are close to the 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time hour. And I know that we also started a little bit late as we were navigating some technical challenges. So first I want to say thank you so much to all three of our presenters. We really appreciate you being with us today. And one of the things we do try to do is not run too far over the hour. But if you do have a couple of minutes to stay on the phone with us, I'm sure we have a few questions that people might have for you. And I'd love to at least take, 5-10 minutes for those who want to stay on the line and ask questions of Rich or Megan or Mark, sort of ask those questions now. And if you have questions that come up later, you can certainly be in touch with me, and I can either answer those questions for you or get in touch with Rich, Megan, and Mark to find answers for you if I can't provide them. And I should have earlier introduced myself more appropriately. I'm Tyler Edgar. I work with the National Council of Churches, and many of you on the phone probably received an email from me with call-in information and log-on instructions for this webinar. So hopefully you have my contact information, and you should always feel free to be in touch if there are ways that we can be helpful or answer questions for you regarding this issue. So questions for Rich, Megan, or Mark before we let them go?
And as a reminder, if you would like to ask an audio question, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. And you have a question from the line of Michael McLean.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Michael McLean with the National Council of Churches. This first question is for Richard. What can be done to see that best management practice followed and used in the industry?
You broke up a little bit in terms of sound quality, but I think we're asking, how do we promote best management practices?
Right.
I would, my short self-serving response is to take the guidelines that we developed and look at them, lay them in front of the companies you're dealing with locally and saying, listen, what are you doing about this, that, and the other thing? Those are guidelines not only for investors, but they can also be used by local communities. It's important, I think, for everyone to get educated as fully as possible as to what the real issues are, what the major risks are, what the options are, for addressing problems. It's unfortunate that the conversation is so polarized that it's very difficult to figure out what the major issues are. Since when the chemical industry will call something black, and anti-fracking folks will call it white, and it's hard to figure out what the real issues are. I would like to believe that we sorted through a lot of those things in our guidelines.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, are there guidelines now that they have to follow?
Well, the American Petroleum Institute will say that they've got best management practices. They're 40, 50, 60 pages of documents. The best companies, I think, go beyond what those consensus guidelines are. The states themselves lay out regulations as to what companies should do, but the state regulations themselves are uneven.
Federal, there are no federal.
Basically, there are bits and pieces of federal regulation that apply to parts of fracking operations, but for the most part, management of natural gas is a state responsibility, or a state and local responsibility combined. I know that in Pennsylvania there's an issue of taking away the responsibility, the opportunity of municipal governments to lay down requirements on companies. There's still a lot of authority in Texas, and one can dig around. One can find best management practices, say, on the website of the advocacy group Earthworks. It's probably earthworks.org. And you can probably find some best management practices there, and maybe they will link to practices in Texas adopted by local Texas communities and elsewhere.
The next question is for Megan. Megan, why can't seawater be used purpose rather than our groundwater?
Well, yeah, this is a technical question that I've heard asked before, and my knowledge is that the companies prefer to use fresh water that they might pull from a reservoir or a potential drinking water aquifer. They prefer to use fresh water because it's easier to mix with the chemicals. It has to do with the chemical nature of the hydrofrac fluid, and so adding briny, salty water that you would find from the sea just put down the hole. And when you change that chemical mixture of your hydrofrac fluid, it has different properties when it goes down the well. So that's my basic understanding of that. But it's what's preferred by the companies due to the chemical integrity of that mixture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for them, but not for the consumers, no.
Right. I'm saying that's what's preferred by the industry because it works for them technically better. And I'm not sure if you would even be able to successfully complete a frac job using salty water. I don't have much of a background on that, but...
Well, I'm not. This is Rich. I'm not a chemist, but in the recycling operations, they're briny water, and they're bringing it down to levels where they think they can use it for further fracking. They will dilute it with fresh water, of course, in order to do that. When they do that, they do have to come up with appropriate mixes of chemicals because, as Megan said, they want to make sure they get the mixture right.
All right, thank you.
So, Martina, you might have other questions, but I have one that I'd actually like to put to Mark that was raised on our question board. It's from Michael Woods, and it says, Mark, what would be your basic theological point of departure with respect to hydraulic fracturing?
I think that all of our major denominations have social principles that relate to our regard to land, water, air, soil, human principles that relate to economy, communities, farm communities, agriculture, et cetera. So that would be my point of departure, is to encourage people in their churches to find out what are your church's social principles, and then look at hydraulic fracturing from a holistic point of view. How does this affect not just a few people, but how does it affect large groups of people, not just people living now, but people who will follow us, the next generation, 2, 3, 4, all the way 7 generations and beyond. So again, that I go back to the golden rule, think of other people besides just yourself when it comes to whether to participate in hydraulic fracturing and how to engage if we decide to engage in fracking, how to go about it. Thinking of others, not just other people, but land, water, air, the environment that will sustain us.
Thanks, Mark. Martina, do we have other questions?
Yes, you have a question from the line of Jeffrey Cohen.
Hi. My question is, what is the significance of the oil and gas industry's exemption from the Safe Water Drinking Act? Could you hear my question?
I couldn't hear the first part.
Okay, my question is, what is the significance of the oil and gas industry's exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act?
Well, my basic understanding is that exemption is known as the Halliburton loophole. In popular news, you'll hear it referred to as the Halliburton loophole. And the significance is essentially the companies aren't required to report what chemicals they're using, and that's the essence of that. In the oil and gas industry, they're exempt from reporting those chemicals that they would be putting in the water and injecting into underground injection control wells. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure.
And at this time, there are no further questions.
Great. Thanks, Martina. I know we've got a few questions on the webinar itself, and both myself and other experts are answering those as they come in. But at this time, I would like to let our presenters go and enjoy the rest of their day, and also let folks hop off the phone. I don't want to run too far over that 2 p.m. Eastern hour. So thank you again to Rich, Megan, and Mark for taking the time to join us, provide an overview of the issue at hand, how the EPA is looking at it, and also how our faith communities can begin to address this issue. I hope folks enjoyed this webinar. We will be posting both the audio and the PowerPoint presentations on our EcoJustice website, and that is nccecojustice.org. You can find both the presentation and the audio there, as well as other information about hydraulic fracturing for those who are interested. And again, if you have any questions or there are ways that we can be helpful to you and your congregation as you are dealing with this issue, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me, and I will either put you in touch with someone who can answer your question or help you myself, depending on what's most appropriate. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon and look forward to having you with us in the future.